See.
Okay, while Joshua is trying to turn on his camera, I'll just give a quick introduction about him. So, Joshua is a Nigerian climate storyteller, environmentalist, and youth advocate. But what really caught my attention that he describes his organization, that's Learn Blue, as a Gen Z powered not for profit on climate and awareness, clean air, pollution control, and sustainability. So, yes, that's very interesting because you have a very direct focus on the Gen Zs, and that's where you want to kind of you are focusing your attention on driving the energy in this generation towards climate activism.
Mhm.
He you start you have I also see that you describe that your climate journey started in 2018 through a lot of uh, personal and there's a personal story to it that you had some allergic reactions, and when you kind of went deeper to that you realize that the air around you wherever you are living, the air pollution, that's actually exerting your pollution, your allergic reaction. So would be very happy to know, like, where did your journey start, and then today I understand you are starting to guide us on storytelling and how do we tell a good story. That's what you want to talk about. But we'd be also very curious to know more about your personal journey, your personal story about it. So, yes, the floor is yours, Joshua. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think there is no way that I will obviously talk about storytelling and not tell my story. I'm going to turn on my camera now. I am very camera shy, so I really do hope everyone
Hello
can see
there.
me. Hi. Awesome, awesome. So yeah, I'm Joshua. I'm Joshua Gabriel Oluwaseyi. I am a Nigerian climate storyteller, an environmentalist, and I've been an environmentalist for about 5, 6 years now. Before I get into class today or the training today, which really would focus on how to get anyone on your side with a good story, I'll tell a bit of a story about myself and my work. So like Devisha said, my activism sort of started in 2018 when I was about 17 years old. Essentially, what had happened was if you live in most, I think the global south, there's a bit of a thing that happens where you have like spring cleanings, but not the US kind of spring cleanings, the type where you are mandated to maybe fumigate your house to get rid of certain insects like mosquitoes and roaches and things like that. And so my family often had those sort of trainings or events I think every 3 month ends. And I was responsible for it because I was the last born, or I am the smallest in the house. And oftentimes the kid gets to do most of the work, or the adults did whatever the adults did. And what I had noticed was whenever I participated in this cleaning, whenever I was made to fumigate the house, um, we didn't know better at the time, but we never really did it with like a lot of protective gears. It was done sort of massless. You just go and you're given a fumigant and you fumigate your house, which is not safe and is not something that should be done. And so I kept doing it. And after a while, I noticed that whenever I was fumigating, I had like a reaction, what I now call an allergic reaction to the fumigants. I was coughing, I was having chest pains, my eyes were red, and I was quite dramatic. And my family had thought at the time that I was trying to be coy, so I didn't have to do the work, which perhaps a part of me at the time was trying to be coy. But I think I noticed that something was wrong. And so I took it upon myself to go see our family doctor and say, hi, uh, XYZ is happening. I'm getting the symptoms. Is everything okay? Um, and I was given a consultation and I did a bit of a series of tests over a period of time, and I learned that I had like insane sinuses and I had something that they called allergic rhinitis, which really is just a medical way of saying that I'm allergic to fumigants and of a lot of different kinds of aerosols, so smoke, dust, even antiperspirants and deodorants. So I had to be very, very careful how often I got exposed to these things. And upon learning that, I think for a 17-year-old at the time, who had a bit of knowledge about the SDGs, I was like, huh, this is really interesting. I wonder how much of an issue this is. And so I went on Google and I Googled like is this even a thing? Do Nigerians have allergic rhinitis? How bad is it? And I came across this World Bank report that had actually said that over 100,000 people had died in Lagos State, which is where I grew up at the time, from air pollution related causes, and that about 60% of those people were children under the age of 16, I think, which was really alarming to me, which was essentially also them saying, yes, this is a big issue and you probably should be a bit more worried. And I had reached out to a mentor of mine, Adam Bradford. He was a Queen's Young leader at the time. And I reached out on Facebook and I said, I found out I'm allergic to air pollution or air pollutants. Is there something that I can do about this realistically? I live in a city or in a country really where now perhaps it's a bit better, but at the time, young people didn't have a lot of say in government. We couldn't be Greta and go in front of parliament and protest, for example. What we had for the most part was ourselves as young people. You can't even talk to the elderly Nigerian person about practices that you're doing that may be bad for the environment because they'll call you someone who has no respect. And so I decided to focus my work with advice from my mentor on young people, trying to see how my peers, fellow 17, 18-year-olds can begin to form habits that are very environmentally friendly, that reduce carbon emissions, that help ensure there isn't a lot of smoke in the atmosphere, that ensure that people around us were safe. Without it, those who didn't even know they had this allergy, that they were safe, I wouldn't have another toll of 100,000 plus people dying. And so that's how I became a climate activist or environmentalist. It was through this sort of discovery that I'm allergic, but also that a lot of people were dying from it, and that I probably could do something by just raising awareness. I think that sort of is a good segue into today's session, which is really how to get anyone on your side with a good story. So people didn't just agree with me to decide to start, I don't know, stop burning their debt or decide to become more climate conscious. They don't just do that because in the global south, in countries like mine, Nigeria, we don't see climate change as an imminent threat or an issue. And that's not because we don't want to, but it's because we've got bigger problems. People are thinking about how to get their children to school. People are thinking about how to get food on their tables. People are poor. And so the last thing on their mind is the climate. And so my work as a climate storyteller really was to draw intersections between your poverty, your inability to get food, your inability to send your child to school, your health issues with climate change and how it's not explicit. It's not mutually explicit. They are one and the same. One of the other. It's like a cycle. And so I first went on Twitter, and I made a tweet about a polluted place that I had seen, and I talked about the fact that essentially, while this is all bad aesthetically, it also could lead to, if there was a flooding situation and there's a lot of we had cholera and other waterborne diseases, if there was a flood, because of the fact that you had a blocked drainage channel, you're more likely to contact cholera or some other waterborne disease. And a lot of people agreed with me on Twitter, and the tweet went viral, and we had, over 100 youths mobilized to clean up that gutter in Lagos, clean up like thousands of pounds of waste over a period of time. So why does storytelling matter? I think it is really because storytelling or stories are a way to connect. Data can do a lot of convincing. When you read something called the IPCC report, for those of you who are climate savvy or climate aware, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of numbers. You hear things like global temperatures rising to 2 degrees. You hear things like sea levels rising. What does that mean for the average Nigerian or the average person? Right? So data is a good way to convince people of facts, but stories are a good way to connect them to issues. People generally are selfish, but also people remember emotions more than they remember statistics. I'm somebody who studied statistics over the last 4 or 5 years, just graduated about a year ago. So I know how powerful numbers can be. I know how powerful censuses are, but I know people don't remember numbers. A funny fact is our current president of my country, Nigeria, during his presidential campaign, he said, and I quote, "Now statistics we go chop," which is basically a way of saying that we shouldn't care about statistics. This is the president of my country. And what that did for him was it was a sort of a slogan that people could relate to because numbers are not except for death tolls, oftentimes numbers are not things that people easily associate themselves with. We don't understand degrees rising. We don't understand sea level rising. What we understand is emotion. And so when someone says, "Are we going to eat numbers?" You're like, "Yes, we're not going to eat numbers." Even though those numbers are probably bad for you, your immediate thought is, let's screw the numbers. Let's just focus on reality. Right. And so a good story really can shift perceptions. It can inspire action. And just with the example of someone like me who started my entire nonprofit work and climate storytelling and environmentalism through being able to communicate effectively the link between my allergies to the lives of other people in my city, and the fact that just every action you're taking as an individual could actually come back to bite you if you don't protect the planet or Mother Earth, as we used to call it when I was a lot younger. It just shows how much power there is in using stories and data as a way to convince, but stories as a way to connect. As I'm talking, I'm going to take bits of pauses in between to allow you to gather what I've talked about so far. And then if you have questions, you can begin putting them in the chats just so that I can get to them throughout the course of this conversation. We've got about an hour and 30 minutes for this. So please, if you have any questions, do write them down. Something that we do at Lemblue and as an extension, one of my projects called Our African Climate Story is we teach people, African leaders specifically, how to, which is how I met Fuja, by the way. I think I met Fuja in 2023 in Kenya. But it was during one of these workshops that we organized at the African Climate Week, which just happened in Ethiopia, the second version. The first one, it was a storytelling workshop where we taught about youth from about 14 African countries, the basics of storytelling and media training and understanding a number of things. One of the things that we focused and hammered on during that session was what makes a good story. Not all stories are good stories. Not sad stories, not happy stories. That's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about good and bad stories. A good story, I think, from experiences, should be relatable. It should be rooted in sort of real and lived experiences. You don't just make up a story. It's not something you should do. Fake stories, no matter how much you try, it can be seen through. It's not as empathetic. No matter how good a storyteller you are, if your story is a lie, except you're an actor, which is their whole job, if your story is a lie, it's easy for the person who you're trying to convince with that story to kind of tell that something's a bit amiss. And so a good story has to be relatable. They have to be grounded in real world lived experiences. It has to be emotional as well. We cannot underestimate the power of empathy. And I think a perfect way to talk about empathy in today's climate and why that's important for stories is most of you may have seen, I know this is a bit of a divisive topic, the death, of the American political activist, Charlie Kirk, and the rousiness, if you will, of opinions on the topic and his death. And oftentimes you see things like, even though he had lived a divisive life, even though he had dedicated his entire life to talking about racist remarks, perhaps, or homophobic remarks, or whatever kind of non-liberal remarks, you should still be empathetic to the fact that his family is alive and he has a daughter and he has a wife that are left behind. Because of that empathy, a person who perhaps most people did not like while he was alive, in death, is now being elevated, really, to such a status where they're almost as though they're absorbed of whatever sin they may have committed in life. That's what empathy does in storytelling. Empathy convinces everybody and everyone to be on your side. It's not a matter of whether you're right or wrong. It really even matters. Case in point, Charlie Kirk's death. It's not a matter of was he a good person or was he a bad person. It's a matter of do you feel empathy for the fact that he left a family behind? And should you mock his death because he was a bad person while he was alive? And so that's what empathy, good storytelling can be in terms of evoking emotion. Empathy is just one of those emotions. I think also a good story can spark curiosity or a sense of urgency, especially in case of climate change and climate action and climate adaptation. When I say curiosity, I mean when I talk about my story to people who are not necessarily even in the climate space, some of them are in this call. I invited some of my friends personally to come join. People get curious about my work as a climate activist or as a climate storyteller, as an environmentalist or as a nonprofit founder. They get curious about climate change as a whole. more often than not, people get invested in climate courses and begin to do their own thing. I've actually spoken at over the last 6 plus years, spoken at a lot of events, webinars, physically and otherwise. And I do have success stories, I like to call them, of people who went as far as founding their own nonprofits because of perhaps my story or a good story that I told, because they felt like, this is really an issue. I think I can do something too. I'm gonna create a school where I teach people about XYZ. I'm gonna create a solution where I build products that are helping, combat misinformation. So many such cases that I have seen over the last couple of years. And so a good story should spark curiosity. And then when I talk about urgency, essentially, if you're going to talk about climate change, look at examples of natural disasters, we like to call them natural disasters. And they are natural, yes, but they are only natural to the extent that it is nature that's causing it. They're not natural in the sense that they are not preventable. Most natural disasters could be prevented, right? You hear things like a tsunami or a typhoon, and you're like, oh yeah, it's a natural disaster. And I'm like, that is true, but is it perhaps because there's rising sea levels that we're more prone to typhoons than usual? You hear something about natural disasters and there's a flooding somewhere. You're like, perhaps is it because the ice glaciers are melting from the Arctics? That's why we're getting rising sea levels. And in turn, because those waters have nowhere to go, and that was not the nature as we know it is not yet stabilized for such unprecedented levels of melted ice. That's why we're having natural disasters and flooding. And so a good story in the context of climate change specifically can spark a sense of urgency where it's like, oh, really, this is why there is so much flooding, or this is why there is more air pollution, or why the air is so dense. If you look at certain cities around the world that have very low air quality index, including my city, Lagos, which I couldn't even breathe in, most of the issues there were not natural. They were man-made. It was from ill-service vehicles moving. It was from someone burning their refuse by the roadside. It was from the improper disposal of waste. And so when you're able to tell a good story, you're able to link these two issues, the air you can no longer breathe in properly, and the climate and how that amplifies that problem. And it creates a sense of urgency for yourself, for the listener, for youth leaders, for government and policy. And then finally, I think a good story has to be clear. I'm going to ask questions toward the end of my session, but as I've been talking so far, aside the fact that I can be a bit fast when I speak, and people say that a lot, um, a huge part of my entire conversation, I would hope, has been pretty clear. And what I mean by clear is it avoids the use of jargons. I don't just throw out words like, uh, I don't know, reports or some data set, and I'm not going into detail about what that data meant. I am fairly media trained that I cannot even fathom telling a story and using buzzwords and trying to sound smarter than the next person. That's not what storytelling is. When you're telling a story, even as a public speaker, it has to be clear of jargon. It has to be understandable to the audience you're talking to. In 2020, I think 2021, during COP26 in London, my team organized an event in Benin City, Nigeria, called Climate Change na Wahala, which essentially means climate change is a problem in pidgin English in Nigeria. And we did like a media tour across a couple radio stations in the city. And we're talking about what climate change is and how drawing an intersection between climate change and a lot of issues in Nigeria at the time. And in all of this, most of our audience were listeners who for the most part, wouldn't understand me speaking English, at least not the way I'm speaking right now. And so we learned very early on, even before the media tour started, to be able to switch at a moment's notice to ensure that what we're saying is understandable. So we go from speaking English to speaking Pidgin, which is a Nigerian vernacular, as we like to call it, or I speak like Yoruba language, Isha, and a bit of Igbo. So I speak a number of Nigerian languages. And based on who I'm talking to, depending on who I'm speaking with, I switch and I change and I ensure that the messaging is very, very clear. It's very, very concise. It focuses on one central idea. Whatever that language is, it has to be understood by the person who is listening to it. So if you're a climate leader in Kenya and you're in a rural community that speaks maybe Swahili or some other native language, find an interpreter to help you ensure that don't go there and speak in English and do a video and say, yeah, we call it a day. That may be cool for conferences and trainings like this or for the United Nations General Assembly, but in more intimate spaces, which are people you really want to even meet and convince about, let's say, climate change, for example, you really have to be able to speak in a clear, concise way that avoids the use of complicated terminology and uses the language that your audience understands. And then, speaking of languages that your audience understands, my next sort of point to make when trying to tell a good story is knowing your audience. I've touched on that a little bit, but essentially, it's not negotiable. You must tailor your story to those who are listening. People on this call, for the most part, are people who are climate leaders or young leaders or youth leaders. And so the information I'm giving you generally is very heavily focused on my climate journey and my climate story. If I was talking to if I was talking to policymakers, even the story changes a little bit. It becomes even more data infused because yes, stories can be a good way to connect, but oftentimes from someone who has been at international conferences and negotiations, especially places like COP, which is what this is leading towards, you need to know how to balance storytelling or emotional storytelling with data. You can often come off as too manipulative or too emotional even for certain kinds of audiences. People who are making policy, people who are COP, these people who are parties of the cops, they oftentimes don't have the bandwidth for a lengthy story about your personal life. And so you need to know how to bring in your story about your personal life, yes, but also very quickly tie it into data and into the context of what that discussion is about. If you're given a resolution about an amendment for something like the air COP or climate adaptation, for example, and you're somebody who has lived through climate adaptation as an African, as a Nigerian, you're somebody who, when you're in your area, the average temperature rises over a certain level, and you're having to quickly change modes of living, or because of climate change, there's less water in the river at certain seasons, or whatever these cases are, being able to connect what you're saying, your personal story, to whatever the topic is at hand would be really impactful, because otherwise your audience, if they don't feel like, if they feel any form of ingenuity in your statements, or if they feel any form of overly packaged, like you say, it's an advert for some sort of save a child, that can actually be off-putting to some people. And so you need to know how to balance it between telling them a story that captures their emotion, of course, but also drawing it back to the conversation at hand, or the data or the statistics that you need to reference to stay relevant in that conversation. And like I said, policymakers, they want clarity and solutions. So it's not enough for me to say, oh, I learned that I'm allergic to air pollution, and then I founded a nonprofit. Okay, that's cool, but what does your nonprofit do? What is the solution? What is the work that we do? Okay, that's why I begin to talk about with the fact that we've cleaned over 40,000 pounds of waste over the last couple of years. That's why I begin to talk about the fact that we've trained over 14 African, what am I saying? Over 50 African youth from 14 African countries on how to tell their stories. This is the part where we begin to talk about the fact that some of those youth who have been at our workshops have gone on to represent their countries at United Nations General Assembly, conferences in Bonn, and so on and so forth. Those are solutions. These are the places where I begin to tell policymakers about the fact that the work that we do has actually influenced policy in real time. In my case, from participating in the International Conference on Chemicals Management, I've been able to say that my stories has been able to quite literally contributed to an intervention that is given at these convenience. And so they need clarity and solutions. And oftentimes, if you focus too heavily on the emotional aspect, you can lose them. And that's where, again, knowing your audience sort of comes in. And this is, again, very relevant to those of you here, specifically because most of you are going to be at COP30 in Brazil. Most of you are going to be part of negotiations and interventions. And so knowing that there is a time to tell a story that is heartfelt, and there's a time to tell a heartfelt story with a little bit of data as well to back it, and relevance is very important. And I think specifically on the theme of media training, the media wants stories that are compelling, that are human-centered, not stories that feel superficial, not stories that are about the masses per se. And what I mean by this is I have had the opportunity over the last couple of years to be featured in a number of publications, Teen Vogue, mentioned on forums. And as grateful and excited as I am about these opportunities, more often than not, whenever I am asked for my opinion or to write something, an op-ed, it is always back to compelling narratives about me, my work, but also the people that my work has impacted. Or sometimes, because my nonprofit has an approach to work that's very Gen Z centered, which Debisha mentioned at the beginning, I often say we as opposed to I. And so, for example, if you ask about the work that we do at Lemblu, I really say things like, oh, I founded Lemblu to do this and this and this, and I led this and this and this. Oftentimes, and if you do watch any speeches I've given on my Instagram or wherever, I almost always say we do this. There's a human-centered and community-centered approach to being able to include people even when they're not there. Because oftentimes, most of us who get to be our cops or whatever this convenience may be, are there as the representation and voices of people who are marginalized or unable to be there themselves. There are so many people who do not even know you exist, but you're supposed to be their voice nevertheless. And so if you're going to be interviewed by media cop, right, oftentimes you want your responses to questions to be very thought out, to be very focused on the people you're representing, to be very focused on the work that you're doing, and should not be focused on, say, something that feels very self-promotional, if that makes sense. I'm trying to get an example of this, and I think one of the examples I can last recall in 2023 when I was at the International Conference on Chemicals Management. I was in an interview with I think Dutch what DW Germany, and they were asking me a couple of questions about myself, and I kept having to, and it was quite weird, perhaps to the interviewer, but I know I kept having to bring the responses back to the fact that I was at this conference because of the work of the Chemicals and Waste Street Platform, for example, because of the work of the United Nations Major Group on Children and Youth. I was at this place as part of a larger body, a larger team. We're about 20, I think 15 to 25 people at that conference. And while I was the one who was doing the interview, I couldn't really entirely focus on talking about me, Joshua. I am only part of something, and so I kept having to ensure that our entire collective experiences was being represented in the words that I was saying in this interview that was going to be aired. And in that way, while I did talk about my personal struggles with air pollution, it still came back down to why we're now giving these interventions on, say, how aerosols waste is being disposed. Uh, I think one of the more recent examples that I can think of is when Lagos State government, which is again the city I grew up in, banned plastics. We commended the government for banning plastics, so they banned single-use plastics. But we're really worried that as people who have cleaned up thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of pounds of plastic waste from Lagos, we figured, there perhaps wouldn't be enough of an implementation strategy for this. There was a ban. It was exciting. Yay, we banned plastics. But at this stage, young people do not need superficial promises from world leaders or from government. And so we wrote and said, we made a press release. It was a coalition of my organization and a couple of other organizations in Lagos. And we basically said, we commend that the government is banning single-use plastics. That's awesome. But we really need you to be able to actually implement it and follow up with it. And so, in those cases, if we just celebrated a ban, it would not have been a good enough story. We can just release it, make a precedent, and say, yeah, we're happy the government banned plastics, knowing fully well the condition of the city in which plastics is banned. We understand the experience of people who perhaps even rely on plastics for a living. There are people who literally sell plastics for a living, and you're banning plastics. So how do you implement it? That's where we come in with stories and give the government advice, and this is what you could do. Now, whether they take that advice or not is a whole other ordeal. And that again is lended the strength of storytelling to push for them to adopt it and saying, this is my experience. This is the experience of a trader who we interviewed at X marketplace. This is the experience of a rural farmer who we interviewed at X marketplace. This is what plastics is doing to farmer A, but also this is how trader B needs plastics to make a living. And so how do you balance the implementation of banning plastics for these two people in a way that's good? I'm gonna pause now. I'm gonna go through the chat if there are any questions. Uh, okay, awesome. There are no questions yet, but do gather your questions. As I'm speaking, I would love to try to answer some of them. Uh, and then this is the part most of you perhaps would be waiting for, which is how to tell a story well. When I started this webinar, this training, and Debisha introduced me and I told my story, it was very brief, fairly brief. It was, and I tried to make sure that towards the end of the story, it made a perfect segue into the conversation that I would be having, which is this sort of training on how you can use stories to convince anyone to be on your side. And so they're very, very simple tips that you can take to setting a story well. I think the very first one that I always tell people outside of webinars even is approach every story or every story really as a conversation, as a value driven conversation. Um, you don't want to impose. You don't want to be the person who is the loudest voice in the room. That's not what stories should do. Stories should make it so that even if your voice is very quiet, someone wants to come offer you a microphone to amplify it because of how moved they are by your story. And so you have to speak at a pace firstly that's very, 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 very understandable. I don't want to say slow because you can be slow and then lose your audience because they get sleepy. But your pace has to be, again, tailored to who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to people who are very exposed and very learned and very aware, or people who belong to a very specific geographical group, maybe they're Americans or they're British, and this is how they talk generally, maybe really fast, you can follow a pace that matches that of theirs, and so they can always keep listening and following what you're saying. If you speak to a Nigerian, for example, the average Nigerian may not even understand what you're saying if you're speaking the same way you speak to an American, for example. And so that's where pacing comes in. If you're going to speak like an American to a Nigerian, you should speak very, very slowly and very, very calmly so they hear you. And in my experience with my fellow Nigerians, we're very quick to call out if you're speaking faster. They will let you know and tell you they cannot understand what you're saying. So pacing is very important. And then cadence as well. I've given a number of speeches over the last couple of years, keynote speeches, even panels, and almost in every single one of them, I always use pauses when I'm talking to allow for certain points or statements or runoffs to be digested. When I was a lot younger, because I used to do debating in high school, I used to use the word literally as I called it a bridge word. And so whenever I was debating, I say I literally or I literally, it was just a lot of literally. Literally for me was similar to the way people say uh, like, things like that. So those are bridge words. And oftentimes, depending on who you're talking to or what platform you're speaking on, those words can be off-putting or breaking your messaging just by using them so often. Because the human brain recognizes patterns very quickly. And so if I keep saying like, the brain will recognize that and begin to get weird about it. And so your cadence then, instead of using bridge word, take pauses to emphasize certain points. Even in this 43 plus minutes of this session, if this is recorded, I think the is recording. If you do go back and watch it, there are parts of the conversation where I do take pauses to emphasize certain points, or to take pauses to say I'm checking the chat, or just pauses generally help people digest what you're saying, as opposed to just going on a run and just talking. That is exciting and fun. But except you're in an actual debate where time is of the essence, perhaps. But even then, you can still employ some of this because it's public speaking, it's storytelling. Even in debates, you do tell stories. And so employ pauses. And cadence is not just in pauses, but it also matters with how you use your hands, how you motion and gesture. Because this is a webinar and I have a very small field of view, you cannot see a lot of how my hand is moving. But while I was talking, I am gesturing like I'm in a live stage and I'm saying, you go here or you go there, and my hands are moving. You use those to control people's eyes and control what they see, that they're following you. If you're not gesturing, people can get bored and you're like a YouTube video that's just playing on the background. And so when you're given a live, specifically live interview or a live speech, what you're doing with your hands, with your legs, if you're moving on the stage, if you're giving a TED talk, if you're gesturing, those things can be very important and add to your cadence. There's a way you move, people listen to you better because they assume you are an authority on the subject. There's a confidence you exude in that way. There's a way you hold yourself on the stage, for example. Also, there's a calmness to how you may move that makes people more emotionally attached to your story. So if I'm telling a story about when I gave a speech, I think a keynote a while ago, alongside, which was very mind blowing for me. I gave a keynote right after the state secretary of the German Ministry on Environment. I had to adjust my speech in real time because I was like, I had to start my speech with, I never thought in my wildest dream that I would be given a speech right after someone so important. That's not something that was on my mind. And so the first couple minutes of my entire talk was very, very calm, very, very gentle. That is not because there wasn't something urgent to talk about. We're talking about air pollution, so it was quite urgent. But in that space, with the amount of people who were my audience, the state secretary, for example, and persons like the executive director or one of the managing directors from the United Nations, UNICEF and UNEP were there. And so when you have such people around, you have to speak in a way that lets them resonate with what you're saying. And so that's why cadence comes in. You have to be very calm, depending on the audience, or you have to be very, if you're talking to Gen Zers, if you're talking to young people, you can be very bubbly. When we had the workshop in Kenya, I was walking around the room. If you see my photos, I am smiling, I'm laughing, I'm passing on the mic because it's young people and we have this energy. And so it works for them. But if I'm talking to older people or people who are in power, people who have the quite literal ability to sign bills into law, I will speak a lot more slower and a lot more refined, quote and unquote. And that is just primarily so that they can hear every single thing that I have to say, and also so that they feel like I give them a bit more room to digest what I'm saying.
Just wanted to
And
take a pause. Just wanted to
yes,
ask because you were talking about it. I just couldn't resist not asking you this. Is it also a strategy to ensure that they put their guards down? If you know what I
yes,
mean,
yes,
because
actually.
many times,
Do you know Yeah, sorry for interrupting the bishop. Do you know what's funny? I was going to talk about that as my next point, which is like storytelling or stories as a tool of persuasion. So yes, people are very selfish. I keep saying that, and it sounds weird, but humans, not people, just generally, humans are very self-centered. We only do things that personally affects us. It's just how it works. We generally do not care about things that affects other people, no matter how much you say you do, and you might as a good person, but at the end of the day, you will choose your life over the life of the next person. It is just human. And so, as a storyteller, I need to be able to tug on the strings, whatever those strings are, heartstrings, emotional strings, of people to persuade them, to get them to let their guard down, to do what you want them to do. And like you said, Abisha, especially for world leaders, this is more important to them. They are very busy people. They have an army of staff around them. They have an assistant, they have an advisor, they have so many people who are ringing a lot of different things into their ears. And so why should they take you and what you're saying seriously? And so oftentimes you need to get them to entirely let their guard down. And this is where sort of lobbying might come in. Sorry, but this is where lobbying might come in, where essentially you cannot. It's like it's lobbying, and that's the right word. I don't say you're emotionally manipulating them because you're not really, you're persuading them, but lobbying in the sense that if I was with a major and I have been in such scenarios before. Say Kenya is a good example of this. I met the former vice president of my country. And I want to talk to him about the work that we do. And on a normal note, I am not the biggest fan of my country's what do you call them, political class, the elite. I am not a fan at all. I don't even like politics. But when I saw the vice president and I needed to talk about climate change and the work that we did, and because he has is someone who is in a position of power and can make a lot of influence, to persuade him, the first thing I said was, "Oh my goodness, it's such an honor to meet you, sir. I love your work, yada yada yada." I don't, not really. While you're president of the country or vice president, I wasn't necessarily happy, you know. So it's not that it's not. I mean, like you could say I'm lying, but it's in that moment by saying those things, and it's really funny. But by saying that, I actually did get his attention. Like, this is a man who was the former vice president of the country, barely 2 years out of office. Actually less than a year out of office. So he has a lot of security around him. He's got, assistants moving him here and there. They're telling him go straight to the conference room. He was even giving a speech at the African Climate Week events that I was at. So he's very busy. But I needed him to listen to me, even if it was for a short period of time. And so the first thing I said to capture his attention was, "Hello, sir. Nice to meet you. My name is Joshua. I'm from Nigeria. Love the work that you did, yada yada, as president of the country or vice president of the country, you know." And so he let his guard down. And I say let his guard down specifically because in Nigeria, and even in that event, there are young people who are very prone to protesting, and so most African leaders do not like young people around them because we are going to protest. We're going to go, climate forever, hey hey ho ho, and that's good. But in certain instances, you need to know when you protest and when you lobby, when you persuade, when you try to get people to let their guard down. If I was someone else, or if I had met the vice president and I said, sir, you were a terrible vice president. What you did in Nigeria, which is probably true, but if I went in with all of that, it wouldn't give me the attention of the heck. The security is going to drag me out of his presence very, very quickly. And so, the first thing I said instead was quite the opposite. And even his security was like sending put away from like the immediate vicinity where he was, but they let me stay and talk. And I'm pretty sure even they were like, who's this man? Like, who's this guy? Why is he talking like he knows the man before? And so that's a very good way to disarm people. But I think the second thing is understanding that stories don't force agreement. I talked about the fact that um, any good story is like a conversation. So stories should not force agreement. They should invite people in. And what I mean by this is when you're telling a story, approach the person you're telling a story to as somebody you've known for all your life. Talk to them like they're your best friend, right? Even if it's the vice president, it doesn't matter. Now, obviously, the way you approach your best friend who is the vice president is different from how you approach your best friend who is a Gen Z climate leader. But you talk to them like you've known them their entire lives, and that's where things like research come in. You want to know who you're talking to. You want to know who the audience is. You want to know who, again, the target is for whatever point you're trying to make with a story. And so talk like you've known them forever. Don't talk like you're afraid of them or like you revere them. I see this a lot with not African actually, generally climate leaders. I've never been to a COP, which is a very funny statement to make, but I have been following COPs since I was 18, and I've seen a lot of time where youth leaders are in the presence of their perhaps government and they shivel and I don't blame them necessarily, but that behavior of sort of like belittling yourself and sort of which is understandable. This man literally has powers to control armies, for example, if it's the president, or if it's someone who has a lot of power to sign some things into law, or a congressman. They have a lot of power, so that's understandable. But when you're with them, you have to literally make them feel, before you can do that, you have to believe yourself that you've known them forever, and like you guys are besties, and you're gonna say hi, Mr. Prime Minister. It's so nice to meet you, and you're very free. That doesn't always mean being overly familiar. Obviously, there's a fine line you have to toe, but you should feel like in your head at least believe it, even if you're not outwardly bubbly. In your head, believe that you've known them forever, and that way your brain is convinced that you shouldn't fidget, you shouldn't show any sign of physical perspiration or fear from talking to someone so powerful. But having been in rooms with a lot of powerful people, I do know it can be quite intimidating to be around ministers from several countries at the United Nations, or being around presidents in the same room with them. It is intimidating. There's quite a literal aura of suffocation where you're like, oh my God, this is like a celebrity. You're meeting a celebrity. But also understanding that at the end of the day, that celebrity is just human. And as they're human, you both have voices. You can talk to them. The worst they can do is say no or excuse themselves from your presence. Um, I think a good story finally shifts sort of values, not opinions. Opinions are personal. People can say, "Oh, I hold an opinion like I don't like gay people." That's a very easy one to use because I live in Nigeria, and Nigeria is a very anti-gay nation. But you can have the opinion that you do not like gay people without necessarily having the value or to want to kill them. Because there are people who are very anti-gay people that they would kill a gay person. Like there are literal news in my country every other time where there are people who would say, I'm going to kill the person. And it's like, you can have the opinion of not liking gay people, and that is your opinion and your choice and your decision. but your values does not necessarily need to be that of murder of those people. Bringing it back to climate, you can have the opinion that, oh, this climate thing, I don't really know if it is all real and all that. But your value can still be that, well, even if it's real or it's not, if not throwing my dirt on the roadside is gonna help, then I guess. Or if turning off my tap when I'm not using it is gonna help, then I guess. Or if conserving electricity is gonna help, then I guess, those are values you can just have. In fact, I have a value system with everybody who is my friend physically. I do not let them throw plastics on the road because I live in Nigeria and throwing plastic by the roadside is like a second nature to almost everyone. They're like, well, it's already dirty, so why should I be the difference? I'm like, I don't care. I have held plastic bottles for what might as well be, I don't even know, I'm pretty sure maybe 23 kilometers before. Like I'm traveling in a vehicle. I've just held it subconsciously with me through several vehicles while moving across Lagos until I got to my house before I disposed of it. The average Nigerian is not going to do that. The average, maybe even African, may not even want to do that. And so you can change their values with stories and let them understand that when you keep throwing dirty here and you're saying someone else did it, if you did not do it and someone comes and they see a little less dirt there, they are less likely to do it. If you, as a person, is in a region, I use it for Nigerians, I tell them a lot, like if you go abroad or even in certain estates that are exclusive in my country, and you see that estate is really neat, your brain does not let you want to throw dirty on the floor. It's just human psychology. Like you're like, this place is so neat. You feel odd if you do it. You're like, Jesus, have I done something wrong? You want to pick it up. And so why not adopt that same value for your everyday life? And that's what stories or storytelling can do for a person when you're talking to them. We've got just like we've got a bit of time left. We've got like 33 minutes, so I'm gonna go run through like the final parts of my slides. Um, I have been given a bit of practical tips throughout the entirety of the session, but I think if I'm going to streamline it into just three, the first one would be, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, to anchor your story on one key message. As a climate leader, there are a lot of different climate issues in Nigeria, so many. And there's an intersection between climate change and gender inequality. There's an intersection between climate change and quality education. There's so many intersections. But my work and my messaging and my story has always focused on one key message. And that generally has always been this sort of change begins with you ideology and the fact that for me, Joshua Gabriel Oluwaseyi, I fight for cleaner air, against air pollution. Like that's my whole thing. And it's perhaps a bit selfish, but it's because I'm allergic to air pollutants. And so I need cleaner air. I need better air quality. I need to be able to leave my house without wearing nose masks all the time because I'm afraid that if I inhale too much bad smoke, I would have an allergic reaction and I could have chest compressions or God knows something even worse. And so that is my central messaging in every single talk I've given or every single article I've written that's been written about me. It's always back to this air pollution cause and this fact that I genuinely believe that while singular actions cannot change the world, while without government intervention we cannot stop fossil fuels, as individuals, if we do certain things, even just as Gen Zers alone, we're a very large populace, if we do things individually and as a collective, that has a mass effect. There's an economy of scale there. If I am not using my water or I'm not running my water excessively, and the other person is not, and the other person is not, and so on and so forth, that means there's less need to get more water from the ground, which is good. If I'm turning off my electricity when I'm not using it, that means there's less need to generate electricity using coal, which is good. So less power is produced. And so when you think about the fact that there are hundreds of millions of young people around the world who are willing and malleable to change. And you can tell them through whatever platform you have, including places like these webinars or through media outreaches or through giving speeches at the UN, that doing one or two things can help them quite literally change the world, then you should do that. So that's what having one key message or two key messages, if you will, can do for your storytelling practically. I think the other one is I always say, and I review applications for people a lot when they're applying for scholarships or funding to attend events. And oftentimes when there's a common question you get asked and things like that, where it's like, what is your motivation or why did you start your work? And I always say you should focus that story, that biography, that response with a XYZ thing. For example, I found out X, and so I started doing Y, and the solution is Z. Or more layman way, you sort of start with a problem, move to the journey, and then end it with like hope or solutions. What is the problem? I learned that I'm allergic to pollution, and pollution is an issue. What has the journey been like? I have started, creating awareness about this issue. I have spoken at events. I've given interventions. What are my hopes for the future? What are the solutions? Solutions could be, I could literally try to create an air filter if you're somebody who is very STEM inclined, that could help with air pollution related issues in my immediate city. Or my hopes could just be that I want a future where the air is so much cleaner than it currently is, and I don't have to worry again about leaving my house and having an asthma attack for the person who's asthmatic, for example. And so always start your stories with a problem, talk about the journey. The problem could be your problem or the general problem. I have a friend, Yomi Mori. Some of you may know him. He's a climate migrant. Yomi was displaced, and his family was displaced in Uganda from where they lived due to a flooding, a climate disaster, and they had to move to Kampala, the capital city. And that was what sort of sparked his climate activism. And when you hear such stories, you're more inclined to want to act because you're like, that really could either happen to me, or it's relatable. When you talk about asthma, for example, allergic rhinitis, perhaps that's a big one. Let's say asthma. Most people know somebody who has got asthma. Most people know somebody who is a farmer or a fisherman who's no longer seeing fishes in the water because of climate change, because of oil spills, for example, which is all intertwined. You're unable to plant your corn your maize at the right time anymore because the climate, the rainy season in my city, particularly in Benin City, we used to, when I was a lot younger, we used to have rainy season and dry season and then Hamatan season in December. Now, there are still those seasons, but it's so inconsistent, largely because of how fast the climate is changing. And so the average farmer doesn't know anymore that I should plant my corn in January and it's going to harvest in March or April, because you could plant your corn in January and suddenly it will be dry season, And so using that's a problem, using that as a conduit to tell a story, using that as a focus, using that as a key message. Like, everybody, anybody, everybody, everywhere, no matter how rich you are, you probably know one or two persons who is suffering from some sort of health related thing that can be linked to climate change, or something more realistic, like a farmer being unable to farm, or a parent being unable to send their child to school because they're unable to farm and sell the products from that farm. And so there's such an intersection that you need to highlight whenever you're telling your story. So start with a problem, move to your journey, and end with sort of hopes or solutions. If you are providing solutions, let us know. If you have hopes for the future, let people know. And then finally, you should always, and I already touched on this a little bit just right before this, but you should always leave space for your audience to see themselves in the story. What I mean by this is, when you're telling a story, again, like I said, I was giving an example with the fact that you almost always know somebody who is a farmer, for example, or somebody who is asthmatic, or somebody who has something that, even the allergies that I have, I'm sure a lot of people who have it. I was having a meeting with the um, director of operations at my state's waste management board for a webinar we're having at the end of the week to commemorate World Cleanup Day. And I was talking about my allergic rhinitis. She was like, oh my God, she has the same thing. She's had it for over 25 years. And she had to go for cleaning of her sinuses. And it was a whole hassle. And so you always want to leave space for your audience to see themselves in the story, because you never know who actually is relating to what you're going through without knowing the exact word or phrase of what it is that they're going through. And that's where stories come in. So those are practical tips that you can take. That is, anchor on a key message or two key messages, depending on how you want to tell your story. Start with a problem, move to a journey, end with solutions or hopes, and perhaps the most important one, which is leave space for your audience to see themselves in the story. Yeah, I'm going to pause again. We've got about 26 minutes. If you do have questions, I do see some. Awesome. So there's some questions. I don't know, should I answer them now, or should I round off my slides before? I've got just two left. Before I answer questions, then we can have like an open-ended session where you can ask me anything you want to ask. I think I'll just round off my slides. Debisha, what do you think?
Sure. You can round off your slides.
Awesome. And the next section is, I'm going to try to provide the slides to Pooja. I'm unable to share them. I can share my screen, but I'm unable to share them now for some reason. But I'll probably provide the slides to Pooja if she wants to share with the attendees later. Uh, my eighth slide is on sort of stories in action, and that is what stories that I've told have done in the real world. And I think I already gave examples of this throughout this entire session. I do need water a little bit. Can you pass me water, please? Sorry. But yeah, so the thank you. Stories in action. When I talked about at the beginning of the class that I had a tweet up that was focused on sort of waste and pollution and how that could be battled upon, how that could lead to waterborne diseases. I also mentioned that we mobilized a lot of youth to clean up, and that's good. That's what Story does. But even more than mobilizing youth, we actually did pressure our government to actually quite literally adopt our entire campaign, which was called the hashtag for a cleaner Lagos, and they made it into a government initiative for cleaner Lagos, where they went about putting more cleaners on the road to clean up dirt, ensuring that sanitation weekends are brought back, and similar efforts. And so all of that started quite literally with a thread of a story that I had seen pollution in the gutter or in the waterway, and I had said, "Oh, this is really bad." And then I said, "This is what could happen because of that." And because so many young people had mobilized together based off of that story, we're able to make enough of noise. I think we had about 1.6 million reach on social media with the hashtag that the government did notice and eventually adopted the entire campaign, which is a lot of good that can be done just from telling stories or tweeting stories in this case when Twitter was still Twitter. A second example of our stories in action stories workshop that I mentioned. We literally had one of them in Kenya, Nairobi, at the University of Nairobi. We had a smaller version of it in COP, I think it was COP 28 in Dubai. And essentially, in across these two events, we were able to train over 65 plus young people from across 15 African countries. And like I said, some of those people have been able to leverage some of the things that we've taught them to either apply for scholarships to go to universities in other countries or to go to events and represent their countries in those events. And now they're able to tell their stories better. They're able to better articulate whatever is in their head. They don't just go to events sort of without a plan. There's always a very good takeaway from whatever they go say in an event. And then, I talked about participating in the International Conference on Chemicals Management, and at that event, I used my stories as a way to influence policy and positions that the youth sort of group was making, and also like help with like in negotiations with bilaterals with governments of other countries, and using your story as a conduit to say, the reason why I am particular about, say, airborne chemicals or flaring of gas, for example. Why I'm passionate about that is not just because it is bad, which it is, but I want us to include that it should not be done in areas where there are children and youth, because there are over 60% of 100,000 people who died in my country were young people. And that was not even from flaring gas. That was just from, and I don't say it just lightly, but that was from pollution from burning refuse and from cars that are not properly serviced and from carbon monoxide from generators that our entire city rely on. So things like that. And then finally, to wrap up my presentation section of this class or training, I think that your story, this is very cliche, but your story is your power, right? I say it's very cliche because it sounds like one of those things you hear on an advert somewhere, but it's true. Um, my work, most of the things that I've achieved as a climate storyteller, as an environmentalist, is only really possible because of my story. I am not by any means unique. I am not by any means special. I am not by any means the person who's doing the most work in environmentalism in my country. Not by a long shot. But oftentimes, why I get to be in certain spaces, in negotiations, in policy briefings, is because of my story. The average person understands and relates better to my story as opposed to just saying you do something because of the sake of it. Doing things for the sake of being good is fine. Cleaning your environment because you don't like dirt is perfectly fine. But oftentimes, stories that connect emotionally tend to be more highlighted. And so when I get into certain spaces, I'm like, why am I here? And they're like, it's because of your story. We loved your story. We loved the work that you've done and how you've gone from being someone who's allergic to someone who's now taking action. And so your story really is your power in that sense. Um, you have to practice your story, you have to share your story, you have to refine your story. Those three things. So you must practice, you must share, and you must refine. I have been practicing for 5+ years, and so you can understand why my eloquence, like someone said in the chat, is as it is. It's a lot of refinement. It's not something that just sprung up and happened. I didn't just become a very good storyteller overnight. My job when I'm not even an activist, quite literally involves communications and storytelling, and so I get the opportunity to practice and practice and practice a lot. It's not practicing when you have to give a speech. It's practicing by telling your story to anybody and everybody who's willing to access. Practicing by doing a video of yourself on social media saying, "Hi, I am Swati or I am Debisha and this is what I do." That is what practicing does. And then sharing that, like I said, on social media or on YouTube. You don't have to be invited to give a speech to share your story. That's what social media is for. You can do that anytime you want, really. And if you are invited to give speeches or if you're invited to give trainings like I have been, then leverage that opportunity to share your story, and then refine that story. When we started our work at Lemblue, our focus was on four global goals. It was on, I think, quality education, life below water, climate action, and gender equality. I think about those four. But as we began to grow over the last 5+ years of our existence, we've pivoted and narrowed it down and refined it a little bit. Our mission has been refined. And now our key focus areas, while still including climate change and air pollution and gender equality, has now been narrowed down to climate research and policy. And so we're not just saying, oh, we're gonna fight against climate change. We're gonna create awareness about climate change. We're saying we're not just gonna do that. We're also gonna create research papers that are very, very deeply researched by our team, and we're going to give those to world governments as policy briefs. We've done submissions with the African Union. We have written research for the United CCC, for the United Nations Center on Gender and Climate Studies. So there are so many ways that you could refine your stories as you go. If you had told me a couple of years ago that I would be running a research nonprofit sort of, I'd be like, research? I don't know about that. But as we've grown, we've come to see that as we're leveraging stories and telling stories, you still need data to convince. Stories would persuade, stories would help you connect, but data will still convince. And so we create research that mails both of them and offer them to the relevant parties as suggestions and policy briefs. And then finally, and I just talked about this already, my slide just says it again. Essentially, you have to remember that data informs, but stories can transform. Stories can connect. So data would inform you, data would expose you, data would convince people. But it's stories that would transform your values, the stories that would transform your audience's values about a particular subject or topic. So thank you all so much for coming to my training. I love that. I kind of love, and I hope this isn't a bad thing to say, that there isn't so many people on the training, because that way it's a bit more interpersonal and I can kind of see every single one of your names and faces. And so I could probably answer your questions even more in depth if you want to ask. But yeah, thank you so much for making our time to be a part of this. And Devish, I'm going to hand it over to you if we have questions so you can moderate.
Wow, that was an amazing session. I mean, amazing is not even the word. I mean, I don't know what to say. But I think how your session was, people are already responding. So, yes, just a round of applause, I would say, firstly, for Joshua. And yes, you can use your react button to send a round of applause. And so I think we'll start with Ekere's questions. He has like two questions. And then Emma, I see that your hand is raised. I'll come to you after Ekere. So yes, Ekere has two questions. One is, aside from empathy, if what action do you always take in public speaking or written form to have a strategic advantage for a good cause or a policy change? So what is it like? What is the, I think he's more asking in terms of the tool. And the second question is, in the big picture, what's your position on climate diplomacy and how were you able to get to the higher tops on your side? Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's a really good question. I don't know that I am in the higher tops on my side quite yet, but I have gone pretty far, so I understand the question. Um, Thank you so much, Ekere. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name properly, but I'm just gonna get to the question. So, aside empathy, what actions do you always take in public speaking or written form to have strategic advantage for a good cause? I think that's one of the things I touched on towards the end of my slide, and that is I talked about helping people review their applications, and I said that essentially you have to, there's like an XYZ approach that I always take. So if I'm going to talk to someone, I'm going to write something. I always make sure that my speech, even if it's an hour long, the first, say, 25 minutes is about X, right? And then the next 25 minutes or 15 minutes about, Y, and then the ending is Z. But XYZ in this instance mean whatever I say in X has to find a way to tie to what I say in Z. If I am giving a speech about, let's say oil spills or something in my country, and I know empathy may not go a long way because oil is for billionaires. I don't know that all of them have empathy. And also oil is such an interesting what do you call it? Such an interesting topic where it's so divisive because most oil companies will have ESG teams or CSR teams that are greening and doing sustainability stuff, but it's like, are we really doing things? And so in those instances, you cannot really rely only on empathy. And again, also because most times empathy only works or works best when you're physical with someone, when they can hear your voice. There's a lot of power in the voice. Writing certain things, if you're a really good writer, which I've learned over the last couple years, it's harder to communicate certain things that could make someone feel empathetic as opposed to speaking it. But again, if I was talking about an oil spill, I probably would talk about the fact that if oil is spilling, let's say in the Niger Deltas, which is a part of my country where there are in fact oil spills, uh, X in this instance would be um, that the oil spills in communities in Niger Deltas are not being treated the way they should be treated. The companies that are responsible for them are not taking enough responsibility, and the people who live in those communities are devastated by the impacts of oil spills. They are no longer able to farm on their lands. The fishes in the water are dead. Sources of livelihoods have been taken, etc., etc., etc. That is the problem. So I'm starting with the problem, and then I'm going to move to the journey. Now, if I'm somebody who has created solutions in that region, I would talk about the solution. But since I don't have solutions in that region, what I will talk about is, but in the Niger Delta, as all of this continues to go ahead, the Niger Delta people are some of the most resilient people you're ever going to meet. They are not taken aback or laying on their hands and saying, well, our farmlands are now gone and so is our waters, and so we're just going to relax. No, they're not relenting. They're fighting every day. They are creating awareness. They are writing and petitioning to relevant organizations. They are calling out those who are responsible for the oil spill as much as they possibly can. And they are trying, for the most part, to vote in good government or good governance to ensure that these things don't happen again. So that is the journey. That is the process. That's what's happening in this particular region. Now, I end with hopes, which is Z. My hope or my solution, in this case, I would say hope would be that our farmlands are arable again. I mentioned the fact that farmlands was an example I gave in the beginning and at X regarding the fact that because of oil spills, actually farmlands literally like the soil just becomes untillable, it stops working, it stops being able to plant. So my hope then would be that that problem, as simple a problem as it seems, mind you, is such a huge one in the Niger Deltas, would be solved one day. And if it's not solved, then the second solution would be that at the very least, the people who are responsible for these OSPs begin to give sort of repatriations, if that's the right word, to the communities that are most affected and finding solutions to solve their problems. Either by ensuring that there are even less oil spills, because I promise you, and this might come as a shock to most of us, maybe not, but oil spills, as much as they are avoided because they do cost companies billions, are not exactly the most it's like one of those it's a collateral. It's like one of those things that happen because we're mining oil. It's not as prevented as one might think, especially with regards to my country. I don't know globally, but my country, where there is no accountability in the Niger Delta and anything that happens goes. What I would hope would be that the oil spills, in that region is at the very least someone is held accountable for what's happening and someone is getting fined a lot for what's happening and there's enough attention being called to this issue. So what action do you always take? I always approach my written text, I always approach my speaking from a position of who, what, why, or I go or why, when, and how. So either I say who is it affected by, who is affected by whatever I'm about to talk about, what is the thing I'm talking about, by the way, and then why am I passionate about it? Or I go, why am I passionate about it? When did I learn about this thing? And then how am I solving that thing? How am I creating a solution for that thing? Hopefully that answers the question somehow. And I think, yeah, for a strategic advantage, honestly, at the end of the day, it comes down to other things I mentioned during the presentation, which was about sort of cadence, how you present yourself, how you're talking, ensuring you know who you're talking to as well. If you're talking to somebody who's dealing with climate-related loss, you know how you talk to them, as opposed to the person who is, a multi-millionaire, for example. In the bigger picture, what's your position on diplomacy, climate diplomacy, and how were you able to get to the higher tops on your side? I've not even always been a climate diplomat. If anything, I've always been told I could be a climate diplomat, that I would be really good at it. I'm like, okay, I guess. But I'm someone who generally hates, and I use the word hate very, 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 very consciously because I don't hate a lot of things. I've often said dislike, but I'm not a fan of politics at all. Like it's not something you would never see me willingly get myself at. Even if I was forced, I probably wouldn't do it. And so for me, for the longest time, I approached climate diplomacy as like politics, which it kind of is. And I also looked at it from an outside lens of, for cops, for example, more often than not, cops are just bring together, specifically climate cops, they just bring together a lot of world leaders who end up actually signing deals behind the scenes to expand their oil, treaties or something. Oftentimes that happens. The cop in Dubai was marred with controversies around that. The cop in Egypt was marred with controversy around how much oil lobbies were present in those places. So why am I going to cops? However, to answer your question, on my position on climate diplomacy, I think that has changed a little bit now because I sort of pivoted from not just climate to a broader field of like chemicals and wastes relating at the intersection of climate. And in this space, I've been able to get the opportunity to join. And recently, I'm just onboarding with the chemicals and waste platform, which is like the Yongo for chemicals and waste, as a thematic focal point on storytelling, pollution storytelling, and rights to know. And so I am now technically a climate diplomat or a diplomat in that regard. And so how I got to the top of my side, I think. Again, I talked about this very, very early on, actually. It's stories. It's my story. It's the power. Like your story has a lot of power, and it sounds cliche and sounds very aspire to perspire and inspire, but it is the truth, I've been in a lot of spaces where people around me are quite literally creating helmets that are stopping concussions, or people are creating tools that are literally sucking out carbon monoxide from the air, or someone is building, a factory that creates something, a lot of STEM projects. And I'm like, why am I here again? Like, what am I doing here? And I get reminded that my story is very important. And so, the way you quote unquote get to the top is by being able to tell your story in the most convincing way possible and being able to leverage your lived experience. Very important. Lived experiences. It has to be either personal to you in that sense of lived, or around you, things you've witnessed. If you talk about things like gender inequality and you're a storyteller in the gender at the intersection of climate space, you will see the fact that women are disproportionately, affected by the climate crisis than men. I did a thing with the United Nations He for She campaign a couple of years ago, and this was one of the things I came to realize. I was really shocked. Women are more impacted in countries where people still cook with firewood, as we say. I don't know, for Africans, say, you understand what I mean. They cut down trees and use it to make fire to cook, and they don't have clean gas. Women are the ones who are cooking, and so by virtue, they're more exposed to the smoke, and there are in some regions of Africa, the women are the ones who do most of the farming, and they're the ones who are most impacted. Even in my city, Benin, women are the ones who are at the markets, who are unable to sell because of something that has to do, maybe there's a flood that affected their shop. And so knowing how to tell your story And owning that story would really, really help you because there are so many. It doesn't seem like it most times, but there are actually a lot of youth leaders who are competing for the same opportunities that you're competing for to be a cop, for example, or to be the voice for your community. There are so many people. What application reviewers like myself are probably looking at or looking for is what makes you the person for this. What about your story ticks that makes me want to have you as the voice of reason? So hopefully that answers your question. I knew that took a bit of time. I apologize. And it's awesome to see that you're also a part of the Chemicals and Waste platform and a young woman. But well, I'm also a part of those platforms. They are really important platforms that I think young people should be in if you're in the climate space. Um, but yeah, let's have the question from. I saw your hand up,
Emma.
Emma. Yes.
Hi everyone. First, I'd like to commend Joshua on the great presentation and just your eloquence and the nuggets shared with regards to public speaking and also storytelling. And number two, I'd like to inquire. You mentioned that you work with an organization whereby you have a focus on working on research and policy. How can one get involved? Are you mainly located in Nigeria or can people from other countries join, be part of it? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Emma. That was I love when this happens. And I love that we have so many young people across Africa and otherwise that just are so willing to engage and volunteer. When I became a volunteer, I was I was very much a outlier in my community because in Nigeria, or where I grew up at least, people didn't volunteer that often. It was seen as weird. You know, why would you want to volunteer and not make money from what you're doing, for example? But my nonprofit, Lemblue, you can find us at lemblue.org.ng. Again, I will try to share the slides to contain a bit of information about the nonprofit itself. But we are global. While we are domiciled in Nigeria, we do have presence across. Over the last 5 years, we've had presence across at least 13 countries, either through volunteers from you name it, Ghana, even I think Kenya, Rwanda, China, India, just everywhere. So because of that reason, we are global. Our research team is based primarily in Mauritius. It's led by Juan Didier Pierre. Uh, I think if you want to be a part of also, I want to contribute somehow to our research team, that would be awesome. The easiest way to do that at the moment is either sending me an email personally. I'm going to put my email in the chat right after this, or we have an event on, you can just check our social media, but we have an event on Saturday to commemorate World Cleanup Day. And so you can actually join the event, and then you can kind of actually get to meet some of the members of the team there, especially our research team, because we're presenting the research to the government on that day. But you're welcome to work with us. We're not strictly Nigerian by any means. We're very much a Gen Z nonprofit, so most of our staff is spread across quite literally the entire world. Thank you, Emma.
Okay. Any more questions? Just anyone wants to comment? Any closing remarks? I do see Hannah, Brian. Okay. Yes, Gloria, do you want to say something?
Yes, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I have a few questions to Mr. Joshua, and I'd really love if you could tell me how to go about what I'm about to say. So, you're from Nigeria, so I'm currently serving in Yobe State under the NYC scheme.
Yeah.
So, I've noticed that the environment, okay, I've noticed that the environment is, a lot of drainages, waste are just all around, all right? I have to be careful. The first thing that I would have loved to do as a journalist is to, you know, gather my report and look for a media organization and report this. But then again, we were one in camp not to do anything that, we were one not to do things that will put the government in bad light. Well, but then everywhere you go, even the hospital, at the hospital 2 days ago and even yesterday too. Everywhere is just smelly. The hospital is smelly, the streets, and the people are comfortable. Like you see a store, and I was even asking the man, like, why are you telling me to throw it there? Where's your trash can? He says, no, I should just put it inside the gutter that he's going to clean it. So these things are very common here. And I don't know exactly what to do right now. Should I start going about telling people, educating them on how to clean the community? They know they should do that.
Yeah,
So I want to know about the most effective ways I could, um, do something
yeah,
about this experience I'm having here in Yobe State and even the state at large. Like if you're driving through Yobe or you're just passing around, you would know that this state needs a
yeah,
thorough cleanup, and I would really love to know how to go about it as a journalist and someone who is passionate about the environment. Like for example, in my place of primary assignment,
mhm,
my boss when he drinks water, he would
yeah,
drop the can in the trash can. So I would pick them up because I mean people that do zobo and all the smoothies,
yeah,
they go to those what do you call them? The waste bin and
yeah,
pick
yeah,
those bottles from there, and you know it's really not a good thing. So waste management and proper drainage systems, that is really lacking here. So I need guidance, really. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much, Gloria, for that question. Unfortunately, as a fellow Nigerian, it's really one who knows all too well that our government can be fun. If like even I am a bit lost on how to respond because here's the thing, and I talked about this at the beginning of the session. One of the reasons why, in hindsight or now in the future, it's a good thing. But one of the reasons why I actually started with young people and saying young people should make change themselves wasn't because I didn't like want to just work with the government and clean things, but I knew all too well that it was going to be lots to convince the government or anything, and much less in the north. You'll be, and you already said something which actually made whatever point I was going to give sort of counterintuitive, where you said they don't want you to put the government in the bad light, and that is the reality. That is the modus operandi of most Nigerian states. That said, I think I love that you're very passionate about the environment being very clean and sort of hygiene and just the states generally being in a better situation when it comes to waste management or mismanagement. But unfortunately, I think for your safety, and I know it sounds weird, but just from experience, we saw with youth leaders who organize events in the north, the most you can do is actually say work with a university or a school on sort of like a cleanup campaign or a sensitization campaign, right? You have to get a school. Maybe I don't know if you have the University of UB or something, or work with a secondary school. They're not necessarily a local secondary school, like a secondary school that maybe it's a private school that has a bit more variety in their understanding of the world. And I say this very consciously and sadly because I know that most of the schools are not going to be friendly at all to these interventions that you want to give. So really, like I said during my presentation, knowing your audience matters a lot. And in this case, your audience is quite literally against you, but it's not just any audience. It is, the NYC management board that's saying don't do things that may be construed as negative for the government. So the easiest, or not easiest, the most efficient thing you could do if you really want to pursue this would actually be to try to work with schools. They're the easiest people to like try to start from because it's easier to again talk to young people when they're in a class as opposed to trying to tell the malam or the your boss or something what or what not to do. We won't know how Nigeria works and how they treat corps members who are too outspoken. Case in point, Ray, for example. but yeah, and I think my final suggestion again would be you can try to look for nonprofits that are already doing work in Yobe State. They don't have to be from Yobe State, because volunteering is one of the most powerful things you can do with your time. Like giving your time to a cause is one of the most powerful things you can do, hands down. And so look for any nonprofit that's already in Yobe that's doing similar work. It could be that the work that they do is not even about climate change, for example. It could be about what's it called? Female genital health, which I'm sure is something that you do a lot of around places like Yobe, as far as I'm aware. So it could be around female genital health, it could be about education, quality education. You can work with those people and then add part of their program a little bit of your own sensitization around a bit of climate or just waste management. And again, this is where intersections matter. So you can now tie it to you can tie whatever that organization does primarily to climate change one way or the other. And that's where stories come in. If you're in Yobe, you can give an example of, you've seen XYZ, XYZ, XYZ in certain places. What would happen if XYZ, XYZ? Well, you've seen X, and what would happen if Y sort of occurred? And then Z could be a solution that you can now offer. So applying that sort of XYZ strategy would help. So yeah, just to summarize this, I know we're out of time. The first one would be I wouldn't advise that you do anything directly. I would advise that you work with in a school, preferably like a university or a high school, to try to organize some sort of sensitization. That's option one. Option two is to work with nonprofits that already have a bit of a presence there. Even the United Nations, actually, I'm sure they have events that they do there. Although the United Nations is a bit of a reach because it's very bureaucratic and you have to have so many letters submitted. But local nonprofits who are doing work around that in that area, when I mean area, I mean location wise, like in Yobe, whether or not their work is directly tied to climate change is a whole other conversation entirely. But yeah, so that would be my answer. Hopefully it's helpful. But again, I'm also aware that Nigeria is a very interesting country to try to, especially the north, to try to do certain kinds of work in. And if they're giving you such a verbal sort of warning that you shouldn't put the government in a bad light, you're kind of stuck with individual engagement. So either you tell your friends or people you're meeting personally that, hey, maybe change your habit, which is what I do with my friends. Or if you want to go bigger, you work with schools or with other nonprofits that are existing. Thanks, Gloria.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. That was definitely a power pack session. And I can imagine, how your stories take you to places. I can now definitely relate. I can just understand why. And thank you so much for your time. This was, and as you said, one of the most powerful things you can do is give your time. And thank you for your time. And we hope to see you in the future media trainings as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for the kind words in the chat. And thank you so much, Pooja, for inviting me. Thanks, Gloria, as well. I dropped my email in the chat. So if you want to reach out, I'm happy to respond or connect with me on LinkedIn or somewhere. I'll try my best to respond to those platforms as well. Have an amazing rest of your training. I'll see you guys maybe at COP. Who knows? Bye, Demisha. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, sir. Bye.
Bye.